Welcome to the City Report Card with Bob Bernstein and Ashley Northington. The City Report Card is a Zoomcast where we explore Nashville through a different perspective, aside from it being Music City, It City, or any other kind of city, except the one we've lived in for a long time and seen change dramatically, and not always for the people or for the better. We decided to do this show after 3 years serving on the Chamber's Education Report Committee, where we learned a whole lot about how the public school district works, how it's funded, and what challenges it faces. After all of the interviews, readings, and discussion, our biggest takeaway is that we cannot judge the public school district without first judging ourselves. That means we can't point fingers at schools without taking a deeper look at all of the systems and institutions that connect to it. And that's everything from affordable housing to private industry to transit and mobility to nonprofits. That's why we're hosting this series of conversations to explore the connections and the relationships in the hope that we can make a difference. So, who are we? Well, I'm Ashley Northington, and I'm what Nashvillians call a unicorn, meaning I'm actually from the city. In fact, I'm a fourth generation Nashville native, and my passion for education stems from the amazing experiences I had having attended 8 Metro Nashville public schools. I'm a graduate of Antioch High School, a former education reporter, state education department official, education policy analyst, and now I get to work with educational institutions across the country, helping them to navigate their challenges and better connect with audiences. I do this work because I know the tremendous value education had in my life, and I want to make sure I can share it with others so that they can have a great experience too. Bob?
Yes, and I'm Bob Bernstein. I'm also a former journalist, moving here in 1988 from suburban Chicago to write mostly about tax and government. I soon pivoted and became a restaurant entrepreneur, opening such places as Bongo Java and Fido. I've served as a founding board member of Hands on Nashville and Nashville Prep, and was a board member of the Bintra Montessori School. And I'm darn excited that I'll be part of the second class of leadership public education starting in January. My interest in education issues came from a feeling that formal education failed me. My wife Irma and I wanted a different approach to education for our 2 sons, and thus enrolled them at a Bintra Montessori school. My oldest is now a freshman at Hume Fogg. And today we are joined by Ashford Hughes, who serves as the Executive Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Metro Nashville Public Schools. In this role, Ashford works to design and implement initiatives and policies that address the academic and social and emotional needs for the many diverse populations served by the district. He also works to strengthen the district's business and community partnerships with a broad array of organizations, as well as overseeing strategy, design, and implementation of the school choice process through a lens of equity and inclusion. A graduate of TSU, Ashford is also co-founder of the Nashville division of the My Brother's Keeper Alliance, an initiative launched by President Barack Obama in 2004 to address persistent opportunity gaps facing boys and young men of color to ensure all youth can reach their full potential. In addition to these roles, Ashford has served as the political director for the Tennessee Democratic Party, assistant business manager of La Una, and on the staffs for a number of political campaigns. Ashford, thanks for joining us today. It's good to have you here.
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me this afternoon. Glad to be here.
I'm gonna start this conversation off with this and see where it goes. I've heard you say that in terms of equity, you see your role as an interrupter, and that equity should be made an action statement. So can you define these 3 terms: equity, equality, and interrupter?
So I think I'll first start with equality, because I think that's what a lot of people say when they mean, or when they're talking about equity. So for me, equality means sameness. Everybody gets the same, right? We want to make certain it's even the same across the board. When I think about equity, equity is not sameness. It is not equality. Equity is making certain that each individual has exactly what they need to be successful. So oftentimes, equity also is about justice. Justice is about each individual getting what they need and receiving what they need in order to have a quality life. When I talk about being a disruptor or interrupter, systems, it means having those courageous conversations. It means utilizing my privilege and utilizing my power and taking that and actually doing things that would seem politically hard to do. So I know that I come from a place of privilege, being able to be in this leadership role. How will I use that privilege in education to make certain that our Black students, our brown students, our students with disabilities get exactly what they need to be successful? And to be a disruptor means you can't worry about your position or your title. You have to get in there and do the hard work of having conversations around justice, around race, around white privilege, and around what needs to take place in order for our kids to get what they need, which is equity.
Ashford, I really appreciate you, your definitions and you defining it that way. When I often talk about, equity versus equality versus what justice looks like, I often kind of say, of course, equality is sameness and making sure that everybody has the same access to opportunities, just not treating anybody different. What I want for the school system to do is sort of to achieve equity and then go a step further. In my view, I think when I think about equity, I think about we have resigned ourselves to the system that we're in. And that means equity is, you know, navigating that system, accepting the fact that we have these barriers and making sure that we can navigate around those barriers so that everybody has an equitable chance to thrive. When I think about pushing beyond that, what that is, what you're talking about as justice. And that is redesigning the system completely so that we don't even have the barriers to begin with. The barriers don't even exist, as opposed to equity, which is sort of like navigating barriers. So I really, really appreciate those definitions. You know, in this pandemic that we are all experiencing, this public health crisis, how do you think the pandemic has sort of shaped the way maybe yourself or your colleagues talk about issues of equity, especially as it relates to public schools?
I think it's so much going on right now that when we hear people talk about the equity space right now, it's mostly evolved around the social emotional learning of students. So incorporating those practices so that students also feel a sense of belonging, but we're looking at different ways to address that student-centered conversation. So right now there's a lot going on around making certain that students have the tech that they need, but not only the tech support, like how do we make certain that their parents and their families and themselves know how to utilize it? How are we communicating with teachers to help them to be able to utilize it? So the conversations right now, because of the pandemic that we're in right now, are really focused on those social emotional learning conversations, but also that tech conversation as well. How do we make certain in this virtual space, students have what they need to be successful? And we know that we saw a lot of drop off from some of our EL families because of that language barrier and getting to and from, like we take for granted, everybody wakes up and has an email address and we work with email. Many families don't utilize email but to check for school stuff. So reinventing and working with them is vitally important. The next step that we have to take as we look at where these gaps are in equity, we have to start having conversations around race in schools. We have to start having conversations around race at the city level, because when we look at the disaggregated data, the disproportionality in discipline and reading and numeracy all flow along the lines of race and ethnicity. And we have to address that if we are serious about supporting public education.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that Ashley and I wanted to do this Zoomcast is to talk about issues we learned on the from the education committee that we felt our friends and family didn't understand. And even though I've been familiar with these issues, I'm surprised every day and shocked in learning that what kind of privilege I have in a lot of ways. I was listening to the Promise podcast, and it hit me that how privileged I am that I felt lucky that my kid got into Hume Fogg through the lottery system. We didn't game the system. We didn't do anything like that, but he won the lottery. And then from the promise, I realized, well, he was also privileged that I could drive him to school every day. And there's all these issues around that I never even thought of. So, and that's part of your job too, as from what I understand. So, and these things are just systematic in the system that it keeps a lot of kids from going to the quote unquote, best high schools in the city because they can't get there.
Yeah, I do. One of my part of my portfolio is to manage the school options team in their process and bringing in an equity lens to look at their process through this work. And none of this work is easy. We're talking about systems wide worth of work that's going to take some time to get situated, but it's the right work to do. We're talking about just as recently as 1998, did the final decision around the Brown Board of Education here in Nashville become like finalized, right? And everybody thinks those things happened so many decades ago, but the ramifications of them are just now really coming into place. And we still, have a school system right now that is still somewhat more becoming more racially divided as far as segregated. So how are we addressing those issues? But how do we make it known so that families that look like myself, that look like Ashley, know that they have options? And what do those options look like, right? So that's a big part of the process. I think about what you said earlier, and this has to be a whole city concept, right? We're talking about really a paradigm shift. And sometimes when you think about paradigm shifts, people think you're talking really academically, and what does that mean? We're talking about changing our minds and changing what our why is. As a city, we have to ask ourselves, do we really value public education, right? Do we? Because are we bringing the people together to not only support our students, but to support our families, to support our teachers, to support everybody within the school ecosystem? School is the only place, maybe church, but school is the only place that every family has to go through, right? So we are establishing the type of community that we will eventually have. We are building and developing people that will lead our city, right? Think about that. If that is our charge, which is the school's charge, is to educate, to help students to read, to help them become critical thinkers, right? But right now, schools are being charged to feed the kids every day of the week outside on Saturdays and Sundays. We're in charge of helping them find housing. We're in charge of helping the parents with jobs. Like, we are doing way too much that is beyond the scope of what educators are supposed to be focused on, right? And we have to acknowledge that as school leaders to say we can't keep doing that by ourselves, being shorthanded on whether it's the BEP formula funding from the state, whether it's the money that we receive from the school system here, right? I mean, from the mayor's office in the city. So again, we have to take a step back and ask ourselves as city leaders, do we really value public education? And if we do, what are we going to do to change the disproportionality that we see with our students when 70% of our student base is either African-American, Latinx, Kurdish, Black or brown, right? What are we going to do to address the disproportionality if we care about public education?
So with that being said, how do you recommend, there are lots of folks who don't have their kids in public school, right? They don't think they have a vested interest. There are others of us who think, well, I don't have any kids at all, so it doesn't affect me. How do you and there are others of us who are in Davidson County. Every day we come to work there, but we live in Williamson County or Wilson County or some other place. How do you anticipate, or what do you think the action steps should be for community members, for business professionals, for all these leaders, and just regular residents who, folks who are just working every day? How do you recommend that they step up to support and advocate around these issues?
Man, I think one of the first things, there's several groups that are out there, and what I've seen in my short period of time is that some of our advocacy groups, some of the folks that really care, and I believe people really care, but they're only focused on the policy piece, right? And that's good. We want to change systems, but we need folks in community organizations that will step up to mentor a kid from his ninth grade year to the time he comes out. We need folks that come in and be willing to tutor kids. We need folks to come in within the community to not only come in and do backpack drives, but when we have businesses that have the opportunity to help schools maybe develop and grow a PTO so that schools in other areas that don't have PTOs can build up the support for the families they need. That is an equity factor that isn't often spoke about, but you have some schools that have PTOs with $100,000 in it, and then you have some schools that don't even have a PTO, right? So the inequities in what one school versus the other school can do. I think at some point we have to have the leadership call people to the table. And this is important for the school too, to know exactly what to say that we need when we bring people to the table. But there has to be a table developed from city leader at the political level, business level, nonprofit, to say, okay, these are our challenges. These are the opportunities. What are we willing to do collectively? And what is our move collectively over time to make certain that we have what we want to call the best public education system in the world? We do a great job of bringing nationally recognized companies into the city to build and develop here. Some of their workers send their kids to private schools outside of the district. Why is that? Because of the perception that we don't have the quality education what their kids need. Well, we need to build and develop that, right? We need to build and develop. So even if we do bring in other companies and they bring employees here, or even for the businesses and the people that live here, we need to make certain that we are building the type of citywide effort to make certain that our kids are thriving, right? I keep trying to make the connectivity that what happens to a kid in 37208 is gonna have some type of effect on the kid that grows up in the Green Hills, West Nashville area, whether it's positive or negative. We can create what that looks like. But if we keep continuing to put everything on the school system alone, if we don't come together as a business entity to say we can't just do one-off type events, a backpack drive, which is all great and we all need those, but we need some systematic supports in technology, for instance, right? We have Amazon here, we have other tech leaders. What can we do? We have Blacks in Tech. What can we do collectively to work to build something that our families and our students have broadband access, that they have quality internet access to do the work, and that they have the support to learn the new ins and outs on technology? What can we do with our universities here to provide the professional development for our teachers to have these courageous conversations about race, to understand many of our kids are on free or reduced lunch? What does that mean when kids are coming to school hungry, or if they've seen violence in the neighborhood, or as they saw George Floyd killed on TV? How does that reflect on their mentality when they're coming into school? Now, take this for an example. Kids haven't been in school since last March almost. Mm-hmm. So then when we do get them back in the classroom, you've had kids that have been in pajamas and bouncing around doing class all day. Then you're going to put them back in the classroom, expect their behavior to go back to the same as it was when they were routinely in class. How does that social emotional discipline affect them? I think there are so many organizations in this city that need to be partnering together to figure out not just the policy side of things, but how they can build a bridge for our students socially, emotionally, tech-wise, just opportunities for mentoring, all of that. We need to be doing a better job of pulling people together. And then the public policy to go to the state to say Nashville needs to be done better by its BEP formula. City, we need to make certain that we are providing what the schools need so they don't have to be robbing Peter to pay Paul to support children.
Yeah, I love the passionate way you put all that and the way you rope in the businesses and the nonprofits. And I'd go one step further with the individuals. I feel one of the reasons we call this the city report card is we want to really grade ourselves. And as soon as the city proposed a tax increase, which I know is painful, especially this time of year, as a business guy, as a property owner, I get how expensive this is going to be. But as soon as we propose any kind of tax increase, which hasn't happened in years, there was a rebellion. And I don't know how people expect to have good schools, to have transportation, to even have a sidewalk in front of my house, unless we're willing to do that. So here's my question. So we call this the city report card. So here's where I want to ask you for a grade. Does our community's actions equal our individual values?
Awesome question. right?
Well, I like to take credit for that question, but to be honest, that's a quote you gave us in our meeting. So that's it. I'm giving you your same question.
Man, I'm a big believer in understanding our why. As if I'm being honest with myself, right? Having been on both sides of the aisle, right? Having worked in the mayor's office for 4 years and then seeing it from this side, but then having worked on equity issues before they were called equity issues for the last decade, right? And have receipts to show for it, I would say I'm gonna give us probably a C if I'm giving the total city effort, a C at best, right? We put our money where we value the most, right? We do a lot of rhetorical conversation and we get up there and beat our chest about the children and the teachers, right? But it doesn't show up on our day-to-day conversation is how do we lead this city forward? Our students and education has to be top of mind. When I think about all that is going on with the new presidential administration coming in, one of the top three things I say we have to advocate for and hopefully that it comes down to the state level is economic inclusion, education equity is number two because they all coincide with each other. And then that ethnic minority and women-owned business piece, right? Because we have to have all of those working together to create and support the communities that we know have been historically marginalized, right? The city, our city council, and our school board have been doing a better job of trying to work together well ahead of time to talk about the budget issues. But I would give us a C right now. And I say I would give us a C is because we have only 20%, two or three out of 10 students are reading proficiently by the third grade and beyond. You know, when I look at numeracy, it's the same low number. But then when I also disaggregate that data, the number one student that isn't reading at grade level are African-American men, young men, right? When we look at the disproportionality of data, while we see that in discipline, we see that African-American students are suspended or expelled the most, but even when you disaggregate that, African-American young girls get the longer sentences of suspension and discipline, right? So we keep falling back on why is there such disproportionality for these students? Then we look at the communities and we see the displacement. We see the lack of investment in businesses, in economics, in job development and creation, and it all ties into each other. And I hate to point it out, when you look at the schools on the west side and you look at the thriving communities that sit in there, you look at the business participants that support those schools, and there's no question as to why those are thriving schools, why those communities are thriving. They put a value on the importance of their kids getting on that trek to MLK, to Hume Fall, to whatever other school they want to go to, because they understand the importance of the whole community supporting that child, right? Supporting that household. As a city, we need to have that same conversation because you cannot separate the child from his parents' economic situation, from their housing situation, from the policing situation, right? All those are connected. And as a city, we have to do better, but that comes with leadership that understands these conversations, that comes with leadership that's willing to listen and learn and collaboratively co-create processes. There's one word that I continue to say in all these meetings that I have is about a co-created process. Ashford Hughes, I am not an expert. I have certain expertise and I can pick up a book, read and learn and call other folks that are doing this work, but it's gonna take a co-created process of myself in central office, teachers, working with community business leaders, working with you all on this call to construct something that everybody says, you know what, we are not just gonna reimagine education, we're gonna disrupt the system and create a new norm, create new systems because our students are telling that to us, right? We forget about the students, but these are the conversations our students are having as we move forward. And that's an important piece of the puzzle that we've been working on during this time, speaking to students and having their voices at the table, creating what an equity roadmap looks like.
Mm-hmm. Edward, you're speaking my language. I love to talk about how education intersects with economics and the breakdown of what, sort of the working class can do, or what supports they need, and what sort of that entrepreneurial class, creative class needs. That's my whole area. I think that we certainly need to find pathways so that everybody has an opportunity to pursue prosperity, and that it comes in a variety of different ways, and it manifests itself in different ways. And the one place it always shows up is in the schoolhouse. So I mean, you hit the nail on the head with that one. So giving your passion, giving your, background, you have a very storied political background. How have you been able to bring new flavor and new life into your role? And I want to know more about that equity roadmap. Like, I want to know first about how have you brought in, sort of your new flavor to this role that has existed before, but I know you're going to give it some new juice. And then also tell me a little bit more about the equity roadmap and what that might look like for MNPS.
So I think coming in and being 6 months in and still wanted to first come in, listen and learn, right? Vitally important. So what I saw, what was here before me was, I think there was placement on focus on a little bit of professional development for central office,
Right.
but it was more about kind of like cultural events, the awareness of cultural events, making those known throughout the district. And while I'm a big believer in those, and we'll still be doing a lot of that, I'm a big believer in systems change and in changing the hearts and minds of people as well. That's really what I'm tasked with. So when I come in here as well, there wasn't a transition document or anything for me, right? I'm a big believer also in putting stuff on paper. If it's not on paper, then it does not exist, right? Because I want to have a roadmap and a record. If I win the lottery tomorrow, the next person that comes in right after me will have everything they need to keep the ball rolling, right? So I think what I bring in here is outside the politics of relationships, right? From the outside. I'm having to earn those on the inside. But I think as I have conversations with folks on the inside and they go and ask their friends that may have worked with me in other spaces, I believe people know that I'm sincere about this work. People know that I have a little bit of expertise, having worked nationally with different leaders on this work. And people know that I'm about co-creating processes, and I have receipts to show this is the work that was done across various other levels, right? I think that's vitally important to build credibility for myself. So what I come in is really understanding that even at the city level, there was a hard time having courageous conversations about race. But in order for us to move forward, many of our children have experienced some form of trauma. Again, the majority of our students are Black or brown, and we also advocate strongly for our students with disabilities. Now that's a whole nother equity component.
Right.
But when you have the makeup of our school, but our teaching core is also flipped. 80% of our teachers and leaders are white. We don't have, that I can recall right now, one kind of senior level Latinx a leader within the district, right? But our school is made up of 29% Latinx students. That's a large portion of kids, right, that aren't able to see the vision for what leadership looks like for them. So I want to come in and really be that person that is passionate, but uses data to back it up. I always want to lead with the why, right? I want to make sure that I lead with my personal values. What I want for my second grader is the same thing I want for everybody's second grader, fifth grader, ninth grader, right? Because I have a vested interest in all of these people being successful for my family and myself. So that's why I talk about really wanting to create an equity roadmap, right? One of the first things that I talk about within my theory of change along the lines of this roadmap is to really influence systems, right? We know that we have 100 plus something schools, right? But do we have a school system? Right now, it's kind of individualized and certain schools do certain things. We need to have some uniformity of supports and uniformity of the way that we operate as an equitable school district that is non-negotiable. My second kind of core component in that theory of change is affecting and developing leaders that can do this equity work, right? Again, it's a paradigm shift to know how to address your kids that are dealing with emotional issues. It's an equity and a paradigm shift to talk to your kids about race when they come in and ask you, well, why are the police shooting Black people? Why is ICE being sent to my friend's home because he's a Latinx student? But you have to have teachers prepared to have those conversations. And, sometimes we stop and start with implicit bias trainings. That's good, but we need continuous training on what does it mean to have a pedagogy that speaks to culturally proficient curriculum, right? But that has to happen over time. And you have to have a built-in leaders that can take a oppressive system and create a more liberated system where students are able to reach their maximum goals and their potentials. So I have kind of like 4 or 5, 6 components, pillars that I'm crafting on my way to this equity roadmap. Not even the pillar, but the foundation of it is an equity lens. How do we take the traditional lens, which always asks us, how do we get the most bang for our buck for the most amount of people? But we take that equity lens to look at, how do I look through the lens of our marginalized community members that are showing the disproportionality across academic achievement, across discipline, and how do we create the steps that we take in every decision through this equity lens? I think that's just the first foundational piece. The other core components, the 6 pillars of the framework, are what I've researched, what I've been working with other chief equity officers in education, what they're institutionalizing and utilizing within their schools. This is Chicago public schools, this is Atlanta public schools, this is Indianapolis, Louisville. Diversifying the curriculum, instruction, and assessment. We have to make certain that our students see themselves in the curriculum, right? So maybe a different book other than Tom Sawyer is something we should be reading or using as trajectory, right? The second one is cultivating inclusive school culture and climate. Vitally important. Students need to feel a sense of belonging and that they see themselves in their school and culture. Third is to incorporate social emotional practices across discipline and student belonging. Yep. What I don't want to have happen is SEL and equity stay as buzzwords. We have to institutionalize these moving forward. The fourth one is to increase classroom diversity and staffing. Again, we have to be laser focused on making certain, and I always am one that gets upset when I hear we just don't know where to go to find diverse talent. Here in Nashville, we have 4 historically Black colleges and universities. We live in the South. We live 3 hours from North Carolina A&T, 4 hours from Morehouse, Spelman. Like, there is talent. We have to be intentional about finding it and making it, incentivizing them to come here to our school district. Mm-hmm. The fifth one is increase and modify programmatic access, and not just make certain that more of our Black, brown, economically disadvantaged students are in some of our talented and gifted programs, but making certain they have the support to be successful once they get into those programs. But again, sometimes our implicit bias doesn't let us see, well, why is every student that we suggest in this class, why do they not look like Black or brown students that make up our district? There's a lot that goes into that. The sixth and final one is that we need to expand and codify central office's commitment to leadership and racial equity. The reason you'll continue to hear me throughout my time here talk about racial equity is because of the makeup of the school district and then really unpacking racial equity. And I know it's been controversial now because of the outgoing president to talk about critical race theory, but it's just a factor that is necessary when we look at the policies, the procedures, and the disproportionality. We cannot talk about equity unless we have a conversation about race, about class, if we want to move forward. And those are going to be tough conversations, right? My wife and I get into tough conversations as we dissect it, as we look at things on the news. So I can imagine someone that doesn't have that lived experience, one, that doesn't have a trained ear to understand how to facilitate or listen to these conversations, wanted to just jump right in. But I believe that's going to take time, but we have an opportunity now to build up these leaders around these 6 core pillars. And really, as a city, say, are these the 6 core pillars that are going to be foundational to everything that we do in schools? If so, what can we do as city leaders to support this effort? And that's why I say the partnership with the mayor's office and Robert Fisher, making certain to have these conversations, not just internal to schools and our school support teams, but having the larger conversations with the city, with the departments within the city, with Mel Fowler Green's organization, with organizations like NOAA. Like, we have to start having these conversations about race. We all saw what just worked and what happened in the presidential election, right? There was just too much bubbling up. And I feel it's the same way within schools, that we need to have a deep conversation about this, and we need to sit with it for a second. Dr. Phyllis Hildreth used to always tell me, sometimes we want to go from understanding what the problem is to fixing. Before we sit with it, before we analyze and diagnose, how do we show up with our privilege in order, with our biases, to impact the things that we say we want to change? And I think right now is a period point in time in schools that we can disrupt and we can create new systems, but it's going to take courage, not only from internal to Metro, but from our parents, but from our supportive brothers and sisters on the outside. That's why I've been making certain to utilize some of the relationships that I had in politics with some of the key influencers that influence politics, that influence people within the city, to say, let me sit down and share my vision with you. Let me share my values with you. And where can we align together to work towards helping these students become successful, right? Because oftentimes when we talk about equity, people think that some student is going to get something left out. And oftentimes, particular, it's white families. And we have to continue to show them they are not losing anything when other students benefit from it.
Yeah, this has been fascinating, and I could talk about these things all day, but I think we maybe when we get really popular and we have the bonus section and charge people for the bonus section, we can keep going. But I think we kind of promised that we'd limit this to about 45 minutes, so I need to cut it down. I think the only thing that surprised me as I look back in this interview is you kind of insinuated that if you won the lottery, you'd stop doing this work. I can't imagine you'd ever stop. So I appreciate it.
I wouldn't stop. I just have a lot more money, and I take like a month off. But I come back in some form of fashion, right?
Well, I guess there was another thing that surprised me, is that Ashley showed up in her car today. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Listen, I couldn't make it back to my usual spot, but I knew we had to get this done, so I was committed to making it happen. I'm just glad I was prepared with my equipment to do it. So I'm just happy to be here.
Well, my Zoom was up, and my Zoom screen, I'm right in the middle of you two, so I feel good about that. The commitment you guys have is amazing. So I'm proud to be part of this. This is great. Thanks so much, Ashford.
Yes,
thank you guys.
thank you for sharing. This. I think that when we look back on this, you'll view me, and I'm giving, I'm doing my little dance and giving you amens, and because you talk my language and I love it. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for being here. That's all we have for this week, folks. Tune in next week for our next exciting conversation on the City Report Card.
Thank you.